Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, sleepy walk into one of history's least appetizing chapters. So, dim your lights, get your blanket, and maybe don't bring a snack for this one, because we're going to talk about what people actually ate during medieval famines. And no, it wasn't gourmet, unless your definition of gourmet is bark soup, boiled weeds, and the occasional unlucky household pet. But let's not rush to the horrors too quickly. We'll glide into it gently. So, picture Europe in the Middle Ages, the whole feudal system in place, castles up on hills, peasants down in the mud, monks scribbling in candlelight. Now, normally, food was already a bit of a gamble. Harvests could fail if the weather had a bad mood. Bread prices spiked if grain didn't come in, and most peasants didn't exactly have a pantry stocked with emergency snacks. When a famine hit, people's diets got creative. And by creative, I mean depressing. But in the spirit of a calm bedtime story, let's float through the menu slowly. The backbone of medieval life was bread. If you were rich, you got the good stuff. Fine white bread made from sifted wheat. If you were poor, you got something darker, rougher, full of grit, because millstones weren't exactly precision instruments, and during bad times, even that dark bread disappeared. So people tried to stretch flour with whatever they could. Acorns ground up, tree bark stripped and powdered, sometimes bean flour or pea flour, which wasn't too bad, honestly, just a little gassy. Other times they went for actual straw and husks, which turned bread into something closer to a chewable brick. And you might think, well, at least it filled their stomachs. Not really. Most of those substitutes had almost no nutrition, and sometimes they made things worse. Moldy rye, for example, carried ergot fungus. That could give you hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, or, why not, death. So, yes, famine bread wasn't just sad. It was occasionally lethal. Let's float over to the idea of pottage. Basically, the medieval version of soup. You tossed whatever you had into a pot, boiled it until it softened, and pretended it was delicious. In good times, it might have peas, onions, cabbage, maybe a shred of bacon if you were lucky. In bad times, leaves, weeds, nettles, and whatever root you could dig up without a neighbor stabbing you for trespassing. Chroniclers mention people eating things like grass and moss. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm chewing moss off a rock, civilization has officially failed me. And yet, that was reality. Slow, bitter reality. Of course, famine didn't just strike peasants. The nobility got cranky too when their banquets shrank down. But let's be clear, a famine feast for a noble might mean fewer roasted swans on the table, not gnawing on tree bark. Still, shortages trickled upward, and people at every level felt the squeeze. For peasants, famine also meant selling off animals, chickens, goats, sheep. Anything edible went straight to the cooking pot, and once the livestock was gone, people eyed other options: dogs, cats, horses, even rats, which probably weren't winning any Michelin stars, but hey, protein is protein. There's this chronicler from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, one of the worst in European history, who wrote that people resorted to unmentionable things, which, let's be honest, is medieval code for we don't want to talk about it, but yes, it was gross. And famine wasn't just about food disappearing. It was about food becoming criminal, stealing grain, poaching deer, catching fish in a lord's pond, all suddenly worth the risk of execution because starvation was worse. So the countryside became this low-key crime spree, with peasants sneaking around at night, grabbing whatever calories they could, And when food ran out completely, communities sometimes turned to the worst-case scenario. Cannibalism. Yeah, not exactly bedtime friendly, but it did happen. Chronicles record stories of desperate people digging up graves, or worse, targeting the living. It wasn't common, and writers might have exaggerated. But even the rumor of it tells you just how grim things got. Now you might wonder, what about monasteries? Surely the monks had stashes of food. And yes, sometimes they did. But monasteries were also pressured to hand out charity during famines. So monks gave away bread at their gates, feeding hundreds of starving villagers until their own stores ran out. And then they too were chewing on roots and weeds. It's kind of ironic. The people who spent their lives copying holy texts ended up eating boiled grass while praying for rain, because apparently God was busy that year. Here's another fun famine snack: famine pancakes. That's what some historians call them. People would take flour mixed with crushed ferns or ground bark, flatten it out, and cook it on a stone. Imagine biting into something halfway between cardboard and poison ivy. Yeah, sweet dreams. And don't forget herbs, not the tasty ones. People boiled toxic plants like hemlock and darnel, thinking they'd be edible if cooked enough. Spoiler, they weren't. People poisoned themselves left and right, because hunger is not good for decision-making. We also see people turning to leather, belts, shoes, harnesses, soaked, boiled, scraped, and chewed until they softened. It didn't taste good, but again, stomachs don't care about flavor when they're empty. One chronicler even mentions people gnawing on animal bones they dug up from old pits, just to get some marrow residue. That's not just sad, that's haunting. And yet, famine always passed eventually. Crops recovered, trade restarted, livestock grew again. People looked back at what they ate and probably tried really hard not to think about it, though the memory stuck, in songs, in chronicles, in nightmares. But let's not rush out of this grim little kitchen just yet. We're only beginning to nibble at the medieval famine buffet. In the next part, we'll float deeper into the Great Famine of 1315, one of the bleakest food crises in European history, and take a closer look at what daily life looked like when the pantry was nothing but dust. So, let's shuffle forward a little. If we're going to talk about medieval famine food, we really can't avoid the grand champion of misery, the Great Famine of 1315. This one wasn't just a bad harvest or two, it was a continental disaster, a kind of slow-motion train wreck where nature, politics, and plain bad luck all got together for the worst dinner party in European history. It started, as famines often did, with rain. Too much rain, not the gentle kind that makes wheat fields happy. We're talking non-stop downpours, flooding, mud everywhere, and crops rotting in soggy fields. It rained through 1315 into 1316 and even spilled into 1317. Basically 3 years where Europe's farmland decided it wanted to be a swamp instead. And medieval farming wasn't exactly resilient. No crop rotations, no fancy drainage, no global imports from across the ocean. If your local wheat drowned, you starved. And if your neighbor's wheat drowned too, there was no borrowing a loaf. Chroniclers described whole villages sinking into despair. Plowing became impossible. Oxen got sick, horses starved. And the grain that did grow, rotten, black, sometimes sprouting fungus before it even left the stalk. So, no bread. And when bread disappears in medieval Europe, society just collapses into a heap of mud and crying. Meat wasn't much better. Cattle died from a livestock epidemic. possibly rinderpest, which sounds like a medieval curse word but was basically a viral plague for cows. So, if you thought you could fall back on beef stew, nope. The stew pot stayed empty. This is where the famine menu gets especially bleak. People turned to whatever plants they could rip out of the ground. Roots, weeds, nettles, thistles. If it looked vaguely green and wouldn't immediately kill you, it went into the pot. Except, of course, people often miscalculated, and plenty of them did end up dead from toxic greens. Because famine is generous like that. Others chewed on bark, moss, even clay. Yes, clay. Not exactly filling, but apparently the texture tricked some stomachs into thinking they'd eaten something. Medieval life hack. If you can't eat bread, just swallow dirt. Spoiler, it didn't work. We also have records of people turning against animals they normally wouldn't touch. Dogs, horses, cats. And let's not pretend rats weren't on the menu too. Protein is protein. Though I imagine rat stew wasn't exactly uplifting for the medieval soul. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette wrote about people eating unmentionable things, which, again, is a medieval polite way of saying, yes, cannibalism was happening, and no, we don't want to give you details. So, let's just float gently past that, the way they did. Now, here's the kicker. Even though crops failed, there was still food somewhere. Grain markets existed. Merchants had reserves. But, and this is very on brand for human history, prices went through the roof. Grain that used to cost 1 unit of silver suddenly cost 5 or 6, which meant nobles and wealthy townsfolk could still eat. And peasants, they were out of luck. Starving peasants rioted in cities, demanding grain. Bakers were accused of hoarding, and in some towns, people were caught trying to break into granaries, which was punishable by death, because nothing says we value human life like executing starving people for stealing food. And famine didn't just mean hunger, it also meant disease, because once your body is weakened, every random infection comes knocking. Typhoid, dysentery, fevers, all thriving in populations already too weak to resist. So you get this ugly cycle. Not enough food, weakened immune systems, outbreaks of disease, and more death. Chroniclers estimated millions died. In England alone, maybe 10 to 15% of the population. In parts of France, whole villages were wiped out. And keep in mind, this was a few decades before the Black Death. So the medieval world basically got hit with a famine, recovered just long enough to sigh in relief, and then got smacked with plague. History has a dark sense of humor. Now, since we're focusing on food, let's float back to what people actually ate during those 3 years. And honestly, it wasn't much. There are reports of people boiling grass into a kind of green porridge. Not exactly Michelin star material unless you're feeding a cow. Others tried eating acorns, ground into powder, which sort of worked if you leached out the tannins. If you didn't, well, you poisoned yourself slowly. Again, famine cuisine was all about options you really didn't want. Some wealthier households made famine bread, flour stretched with beans, peas, even sawdust. Yes, sawdust. It filled the stomach, but also shredded your insides. So, technically food, but also technically not great for survival. One chronicler even claimed that mothers abandoned children, or worse. We're not going to linger on that because the vibe here is sleepy, not horrifying. But the point is, desperation went to extremes. And medieval famine food wasn't about nourishment. It was about pretending to eat long enough to maybe not die. Eventually, around 1317, the rain stopped. Harvests started creeping back to normal. The famine receded, but the memory lingered. Songs, prayers, and sermons all mentioned the great hunger. People who lived through it carried scars for life, and many villages just vanished, never repopulated. But for us, drifting here centuries later, the legacy is the bizarre menu of desperation: clay, moss, bark bread, famine pancakes, dog stew, and the occasional awkward silence about unmentionable things. It was the worst restaurant Europe ever hosted, and everyone got invited. Let's gently move on, because while the Great Famine was the big headline, there were plenty of smaller famines before and after, little local food shortages, each with their own sad menus. And honestly, some of the most interesting details come from those everyday hunger years. So in the next part, we'll float into smaller medieval famines, the kind that didn't kill millions, but still forced people into some pretty questionable dining decisions. All right, let's drift away from the thunderstorm of 1315. That was Europe's big famine, the one that wiped out millions. But medieval life was dotted with smaller, more local famines too. Little flashes of hunger, bad harvests in one region, a military campaign in another, maybe a greedy noble hiking up grain prices just because he could. And for the average peasant, those small famines didn't feel small at all. They meant scraping together meals from whatever scraps the land would give. And the land, to be honest, was not feeling generous. So let's talk about famine bread again, because it really was the poster child for these hard times. When wheat ran out, people got inventive. And inventive here basically means desperate. They stretched flour with acorns. That's fine if you know how to leach the tannins. If you don't, your stomach stages a protest. Others mixed in straw, bran, or crushed beans. A nice chewy texture, but little actual food value. Then there was tree bark, pine, birch, oak, stripped, dried, ground up, and added to dough. Congratulations, you've just invented bark bread. Nutritious? Number. Edible? Barely. Sad. Always. One chronicler from Scandinavia noted that in some years, bark bread was so common people ate it daily. So much for daily bread being a blessing. This was daily bark, and it shredded your insides like sandpaper. Then we have famine pottage. If bread was failing, you turned to the pot. Medieval pottage could be cozy in good times: peas, lentils, onions, maybe a chunk of bacon. In famine years, leaves, weeds, and more weeds. Nettles were popular. Boil them long enough and they stop stinging. You end up with a sort of green sludge, bitter but filling. Other wild plants joined the mix: sorrel, docks, goosefoot, even thistles. Basically, if it was leafy and not instantly fatal, it went in the pot. And some people weren't great at plant identification, which is how folks ended up boiling poisonous herbs like darnel and hemlock, hoping cooking would make them safe. Spoiler, it didn't. Imagine starving yourself to death by accident just because you misidentified a salad. And then there's famine meat, or rather, the absence of it. Livestock was precious. Normally you only killed an animal when it was too old to work. But famine flipped the rules. Cows, pigs, goats, sold off or slaughtered to keep people alive. And once those were gone, famine menus got darker. People ate horses, dogs, and cats. Horses especially. In times of hunger, they became walking stew pots. Dogs and cats were more of a last resort. Chroniclers mention it with that medieval "let's not dwell on this" tone, but the implication is clear. And of course, rodents, rats, mice, anything that moved. Peasants trapped them, roasted them, and called it dinner. Some towns even put official bounties on rats, both to reduce disease and to give people something however disgusting, to chew on. Another famine delicacy was leather, shoes, belts, saddles, soaked, boiled, scraped, and chewed. It softened just enough to trick the stomach. No nutrition, but at least you weren't chewing air. In some places, bones were dug up from old pits. Not for cannibalism necessarily, more like marrow scraping. People boiled bones, hoping to coax out even a ghost of fat or protein. It's hard to think of anything more depressing than gnawing on a centuries-old cow bone for dinner. Now, famine was never just about food. It reshaped society in small but sharp ways. Markets collapsed. Grain riots broke out. Bakers were accused of hoarding, sometimes killed by mobs. Because when you're hungry, the baker looks suspiciously well fed. And of course, crime spiked. Poaching, fishing in forbidden rivers, stealing grain from granaries. In normal years, that got you whipped or fined. In famine years, people risked execution for it, which makes sense. If you're starving, a rope around your neck feels less scary than an empty stomach. Let's not forget monasteries. Monks kept grain stores, and charity was part of their duty. So, in many famines, long lines formed outside monastery gates, villagers waiting for bread handouts while monks prayed for rain. But once the stores were gone, monks suffered too. Some records say monasteries were reduced to feeding themselves on boiled weeds. Imagine devoting your life to God and winding up eating moss stew. That's faith put to the test. We also see famine shaping culture. Songs, folk tales, sermons. Priests preached that famine was God's punishment, maybe for greed, maybe for sin, or maybe just because God was in one of those mysterious moods. Either way, people were told to pray harder while chewing on bark pancakes. Folk tales carried famine memories too, stories of clever peasants tricking lords into giving them food, or dark tales of villages where hunger turned neighbors against each other. Generations later, people still told those stories around fires because famine left scars that outlived the actual hunger. And famine had one more fun side effect: class tension. The poor starved, the rich suffered less. So resentment grew. Peasants saw nobles feasting while villages gnawed bark. And while open revolts weren't always possible, the anger simmered. Sometimes it boiled over into uprisings. Other times it just lived quietly in songs and curses muttered under breath. But famine always reminded everyone of the same thing. Society was fragile. One rainy season, one war, one greedy lord, and suddenly the menu was moss soup. So, smaller famines might not have killed millions like the Great Famine did, but they shaped daily life just as much. They forced people to invent strange recipes. They drove crime, faith, folklore, and quiet rebellion. And they kept medieval diets balanced on the edge of disaster. Now, let's drift again, because famine wasn't just about food and hunger. It was about the weird psychology of living with scarcity. The rituals, the prayers, the strange superstitions about why crops failed and what to do about it. In the next part, we'll wander into the mindset of famine, how medieval people thought about hunger, and the odd little coping mechanisms they invented along the way. So, let's float a little away from the muddy fields and moss soup. Because famine wasn't just about what people chewed on. It was about how they made sense of it all. And medieval people, to put it gently, had a lot of creative explanations. When crops failed, the first suspect was usually God. Apparently, he was keeping score, and the peasants were losing. Priests preached that hunger was divine punishment for sins, for greed, for not fasting properly, or maybe just because the local bishop was annoying. The reasons shifted, but the conclusion stayed the same. If you're starving, you probably deserved it. Not exactly comforting when your dinner is boiled nettles, but that's how sermons went. And yet, people didn't stop with God. Oh no, famine superstition spread in every direction. Some blamed witches, because obviously, if your barley drowned in rain, it must have been old Margaret down the lane muttering curses. Never mind that it had rained nonstop for a month. Better burn a woman just in case. Others blamed Jews in the same tragic rhythm that haunted medieval Europe. Accusations that Jews had poisoned wells or bewitched the weather flared up whenever crops failed. And famine often turned into pogroms because people wanted a scapegoat and neighbors were an easy target. On a more magical level, people tried rituals. They carried relics into the fields. They held processions, praying for sunshine or rain. Sometimes villagers walked barefoot around their farmland, chanting. In France, they had rogation days, when everyone paraded through the fields, begging God for mercy. It didn't always work. Actually, it never really worked. But it gave people something to do while they were starving. Monks also wrote special prayers. You can almost imagine them scribbling in the margins, "O Lord, grant us bread, preferably wheat, not bark." And when nothing happened, well, they just prayed harder. Hunger also shaped dreams and visions. People claimed to see saints handing out loaves of bread, or angels promising that next year's harvest would be better. Whether or not those visions helped, at least they gave starving villagers a mental snack. Chroniclers also mention that famine triggered waves of religious hysteria. Flagellants marching through towns, whipping themselves to appease God. Because clearly, if your fields drowned, the solution was to beat yourself bloody in the town square. That'll fix the wheat. Of course, not all famine psychology was religious. Some of it was just coping. Dark humor. Medieval villagers joked about their diets the way people today joke about bad airplane food. They sang mocking songs about bark bread, because sometimes laughter was the only seasoning available, and some coping came in the form of rituals that made no practical sense but gave people structure, like eating meals in silence, as if pretending it was a fast, not starvation, or setting aside a crumb of bread as an offering, hoping it would magically multiply. Spoiler, it didn't, but the ritual at least made people feel like they were participating in their own survival. The wealthy, of course, had different famine psychology. Nobles worried less about eating and more about riots, so they told peasants to be patient and prayed loudly in public while eating in private. Some nobles even staged public feasts, symbolic meals where they handed out bread to the poor. It didn't actually solve anything, but it made them look generous, kind of like medieval PR. Meanwhile, peasants developed a different perspective. For them, famine was proof that lords and kings didn't care. So, in whispered conversations, they talked about justice, rebellion, or just hating the rich. It rarely went further, but the psychological seeds of class anger were planted in every hungry stomach. Superstition also shaped what people ate. Certain foods were thought to hold protective power: garlic, onions, herbs blessed by priests. If you ate them, maybe the famine wouldn't kill you, or at least you'd smell bad enough that death would pass you by. Some even believed that eating certain weeds was holy. Nettles, for example, were associated with endurance. So a bowl of nettle soup wasn't just sad. It was spiritually uplifting, supposedly, because nothing says divine resilience like chewing boiled, stinging plants. And then, There were omens. People saw famine in the sky. Comets, eclipses, weird colored sunsets, all interpreted as signs that hunger was coming. If a cow mooed strangely, famine. If bread cracked in the oven, famine. Basically, everything was a sign of famine, including famine itself, which wasn't exactly helpful, but at least people felt like the universe was giving them hints. Psychology also played out in how famine ended. When rain stopped and harvest improved, people credited saints, relics, or prayer processions. Nobody said, "Hey, the weather just changed." They said, "Thank God for answering us." And then they celebrated with bread festivals, harvest dances, and probably overeating, because who wouldn't? But famine trauma lingered. Children who grew up hungry carried the fear for life. Chroniclers note that survivors often hoarded food even in good years. Little private stashes of grain hidden in cottages, like a medieval version of panic buying toilet paper. It was the same psychology, really. Scarcity rewires the brain, and medieval people were no exception. So famine wasn't just about eating bark bread and moss. It was about the stories, the rituals, the fear, and the coping. It was religion twisted into hunger sermons. It was superstitions about witches and comets. It was humor, omens, and private stashes of beans. A whole psychological landscape shaped by the absence of food. And while famine eventually faded each time, the mental scars stayed. They became part of the culture. They became warnings passed down in songs and prayers. And they taught everyone one simple truth. Food wasn't just survival. Food was meaning. Let's float forward again. Because famine didn't just happen in the countryside, cities had their own struggles with hunger, markets collapsing, bread riots, urban poor boiling weeds in back alleys, and honestly, some of the most vivid famine stories come from inside the city walls. So in the next part, we'll drift into urban life during famine, how towns handled scarcity, and how quickly people turned on each other when bread vanished. So far, we've mostly been drifting around the muddy countryside. Fields, peasants, nettle soup, and bark bread. But let's move into the towns and cities for a bit, because famine in a medieval city had its own flavor, and none of it was good. At first glance, cities seemed safer. Markets, granaries, bakers, butchers. Surely that meant food. But when famine struck, cities were some of the worst places to be. Why? Because more people meant more mouths to feed, and no fields inside the city walls meant total dependence on imports. If the countryside failed, the cities starved faster than villages. Bread was the center of it all. Medieval urban diets revolved around bread the way modern diets revolve around sugar. If you had bread, you could survive. If you didn't, you rioted. And people did riot. Bread shortages triggered some of the earliest recorded urban uprisings in Europe. Crowds stormed bakeries, accusing bakers of hoarding grain. Sometimes bakers were lynched right in front of their ovens, which is dark but also telling. Nobody cared about the mayor, nobody cared about city councils, but touch the bread supply, and suddenly everyone was a revolutionary. Authorities tried to manage famine with price controls. In England, France, and the Low Countries, city officials set maximum bread prices. In theory, that kept bakers from gouging the poor. In practice, it just meant bakers used smaller loaves or worse ingredients, so people ended up paying the same for less and with extra gravel mixed in, because medieval millstones left grit in flour anyway. Now famine bread just had a bonus crunch. Some cities had granaries controlled by the local government or the church. In times of famine, grain was rationed out. Queues stretched through the streets. People waited hours for a chance at a loaf the size of a fist. And if supplies ran out before your turn, too bad. No bread for you today. Try moss soup instead. Water didn't help, because let's be honest, medieval water was not exactly sparkling clean. People relied on ale, weak beer basically, as their main drink. But ale required grain too. So in famine years, even the beer ran out. Now imagine being medieval and hungry and sober. Truly a nightmare. And famine didn't just hit the poor. Even wealthy merchants felt the squeeze. Their stored grain might keep them going, but as riots broke out, their warehouses became targets. So the rich hired guards to protect their supplies, while starving neighbors banged on the doors. Great for class relations. Nobles in cities also faced tough choices. Do they distribute grain and look generous, or hoard it for their households and risk rebellion? Some tried public charity, handing out loaves in the market square, but there were never enough to go around, and starving crowds don't stay polite for long. Crime spiked everywhere: theft, mugging, pickpocketing. Food became currency. A loaf of bread might be worth more than a silver coin. People pawned clothing, tools, even their homes for a sack of grain. And when nothing was left to trade, they begged. Cities filled with beggars, crying at the doors of churches and merchants' houses. The sound of famine wasn't just empty stomachs, it was constant voices asking for food. Now city governments loved order, so they tried punishments, harsh ones. If you were caught stealing bread, you might lose a hand. If you broke into a granary, execution. And if you rioted, the militia was called in, because nothing says solution like stabbing a few starving peasants to calm the others. Did it work? Not really. But at least it made city officials feel like they were doing something. Meanwhile, the church doubled down on prayers. Processions wound through city streets. Clergy carried relics, saintly bones, holy crosses, begging for divine mercy. People sang hymns with empty stomachs, and afterward they went home to nothing. God, apparently, was still not in a sharing mood. Chroniclers describe urban famine as particularly grim. The smell of rotting bodies in alleys, children abandoned on doorsteps, crowds fighting over scraps at butcher stalls, and yet life went on. Markets stayed open, even if the only thing for sale was moldy peas. Bakers still baked, even if the loaves were mostly straw. People adapted because there wasn't another choice. Let's not forget about famine diseases in cities. Starvation plus crowding was a recipe for epidemics. Typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, all more deadly when people were weakened by hunger. And since sanitation was basically throw your waste in the street and hope for the best, diseases spread fast. So famine wasn't just not eating, it was starving and then catching something nasty from your neighbor. One of the more surreal famine customs was the famine wedding. Sometimes when famine dragged on, young couples married anyway. Not because it was romantic, but because two starving households joining forces meant a slightly better chance of survival. It wasn't exactly a fairy tale, but in famine logic, pooling your moss stew with someone else's moss stew counted as a strategy. Of course, eventually, famine eased. Trade resumed, harvests recovered, and cities refilled their granaries. But scars lingered here too. Riots left memories. Families remembered pawning everything they owned for bread, and officials remembered the fragility of their control. In some places, new regulations were created after famine, like mandatory grain reserves or stricter price laws. because no city wanted a repeat of mobs chasing bakers through the streets. So famine in the city was loud, crowded, and tense. Bread riots, grain guards, desperate beggars, and sermons echoing through streets. It was different from the countryside, but no less miserable. Maybe even worse, because hunger was in your face everywhere you turned. Let's float onward, because famine didn't just affect peasants and townsfolk, it touched the nobility too, though in very different ways. When kings and queens faced famine, it wasn't about moss stew, it was about prestige, politics, and holding on to power when everyone around them was starving. In the next part, we'll drift into the high tables of medieval famine, how nobles and royalty navigated hunger, and the strange mix of abundance and anxiety that defined their experience. We've seen peasants boiling moss. We've seen townsfolk rioting over bread. But what about the people at the very top? The kings, queens, dukes, and ladies in silk? Surely famine didn't touch them, right? Well, not quite. First thing to note, nobles didn't starve in the same way commoners did. Their estates gave them the best chance of survival. They had storehouses, game preserves, and access to trade. If you were a duke in France, you might still eat venison and drink wine while peasants outside gnawed on weeds. But famine still changed noble life, because food wasn't just nutrition, it was politics. A lord's job was to feed his household. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of retainers, soldiers, servants, and hangers-on expected daily meals. If the kitchens ran short, the lord's reputation collapsed. A hungry knight is not a loyal knight, so even nobles with food worried constantly about supplies. They couldn't just eat in private and ignore the rest. Their prestige was measured by the size of their feasts, and famine made feasting tricky. Medieval chronicles often mention nobles who tried to keep up appearances during famine. Banquets were still held, even if the courses were thinner. Instead of dozens of meat dishes, maybe only a handful. Instead of exotic spices, a little parsley sprinkled hopefully on top. Guests noticed. They always noticed, because in a culture obsessed with honor, a half-empty feast was basically an admission of weakness. Royalty, of course, had it slightly better. Kings could command grain from across their realm. They ordered emergency shipments, requisitioned supplies, and sometimes just seized what they wanted. Peasants suffered so palaces could stay stocked. But even for kings, famine was dangerous, not because they personally went hungry, but because famine caused unrest. Riots, revolts, angry mobs, all blamed the ruler. A king who couldn't keep bread on the table wasn't much of a king. Take France in the early 14th century. During the Great Famine, King Philip V tried to manage grain shortages with strict controls. He banned exports, fixed prices, and ordered grain hoarded in royal storehouses. On paper, it looked organized. In practice, it just made people angrier. Merchants smuggled grain anyway, prices still rose, and the poor blamed the crown. So even if Philip's table never went empty, his popularity did. And in monarchy, popularity meant survival. Noble women, especially queens, sometimes stepped into the role of food distributors. They gave alms in public squares, handing out bread or coins to starving subjects. It was part charity, part theater, because nothing made a queen look more saintly than being the mother of her people in hard times. Chroniclers loved those stories. Of course, they left out the fact that the loaves handed out were usually symbolic, a few hundred at most, in cities of thousands. Still, it was better than nothing, and it looked good in the family chronicle. In courts, Famine also shaped conversation. Letters between nobles are full of complaints about grain shortages and bad wine vintages. Diplomatic banquets shrank in scale, which made diplomacy harder. Imagine inviting an ambassador and only serving him a sad bowl of pea soup. Not the best way to impress. So famine wasn't just hunger, it was embarrassment. And medieval nobles feared embarrassment almost as much as death. Another odd side effect, hunting. Nobles hunted for sport and for food. But in famine years, pressure increased. Deer, boar, rabbits, all were harvested more heavily. Peasants sometimes poached on noble lands out of desperation. That was a crime, punishable by hanging. So famine years saw spikes in arrests for poaching. The irony was rich. Peasants hanged for stealing rabbits while nobles feasted on venison. But that was the medieval system. Justice tilted in favor of the well-fed. Even religion played a role at the noble table. Nobles funded extra masses, hoping God would bless the harvest. They commissioned processions, relic showings, and fasting rituals. Yes, fasting in the middle of famine, a kind of double-layered irony. The poor were fasting involuntarily. The rich were fasting for the sake of the realm. And afterward, the rich still got dinner. One imagines God rolling his eyes, but nobles weren't entirely immune. In prolonged famines, even their supplies dwindled. Imported delicacies disappeared. Spices, sugar, wine, all became rare luxuries. And hunger crept closer. Lower-ranking nobles sometimes had to sell land to survive. A knight with no fields couldn't feed his household. And once your retainers left, you slid down the ladder fast. So famine didn't just hurt peasants. It reshuffled the noble hierarchy too. Royal courts in particular developed an image problem. When peasants starved, rumors spread about kings eating swan and peacock in gilded halls. Were the rumors true? Sometimes, yes. But even if the court's food was modest, the perception of excess caused resentment. Chronicles mention peasants shouting insults at processions, calling nobles fat while we die. So famine widened the gulf between classes. The poor grew angrier, the rich grew more defensive, and trust crumbled like stale bread. Children of nobles weren't spared either. During major famines, even aristocratic infants suffered malnutrition. Milk supplies ran low. Nannies and wet nurses had nothing to give. We see spikes in child mortality across all classes, not as dramatic for the rich, but still visible. So famine left scars on noble families, even in their nurseries. And finally, politics. Famine was a weapon. Nobles hoarded grain to control their vassals. Kings used grain to buy loyalty. Wars were won and lost depending on which side could keep feeding its troops. And when famine stretched on, rebellion simmered. Starving peasants looked for someone to blame, and nobility made the easiest target. So famine wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a political crisis, one that could topple dynasties if handled badly. So yes, nobles sat at higher tables. Their bread was whiter, their soups richer, their meat portions larger. But famine still crept into their castles. It was felt in shrinking banquets, restless nights, angry peasants, and tense negotiations. And while nobles almost never starved, they did lose face, power, and sometimes even thrones. Let's drift one step further now. We've seen famine among peasants, townsfolk, and nobles. But what about the church? How did monks, abbots, and bishops deal with hunger? After all, monasteries were famous for their granaries and cellars, and yet even they weren't immune to the great empty stomach of medieval Europe. That's where we'll float next. We've wandered through peasant huts, noisy city streets, and gilded courts. Now let's drift into the cloister, because monasteries had their own relationship with famine, one that was half practical and half painfully ironic. Monasteries were supposed to be places of stability. They had land, granaries, vineyards, and steady income from tithes. In theory, monks shouldn't have worried too much about famine. They prayed, they farmed, they brewed beer, and they stored food for the long haul. But in theory and in famine, rarely matched. Let's start with the practical side. Monks farmed. Every monastery worth its salt had farmland attached, fields of grain, orchards, vegetable gardens. They also had fish ponds, which sounds charming until you realize it was just medieval aquaculture. So when famine hit, monasteries were better supplied than most villages, but they weren't bottomless buffets. Bad harvests still ruined monastic stores. Fish ponds went empty. Cows dried up. Even monks had to make moss soup sometimes. But here's the twist. Monasteries had obligations. They were supposed to feed the poor. Hospitality was part of the rule. That meant giving food to beggars at the gate, to travelers on the road, and to neighbors in distress. During famine, the demand skyrocketed. Lines of starving people stretched outside abbey walls, and monks had to decide, feed the outsiders or keep enough for themselves. A holy dilemma, solved usually by compromise. Give out some bread, then quietly lock the cellar before it ran dry. The church also collected tithes. Peasants owed grain, animals, and money to their local parish. But in famine years, they had nothing to give. Priests still demanded payment because the bishop's table didn't fill itself. This created huge resentment. Imagine starving while the church insisted on its tenth of your non-existent harvest. People didn't exactly feel spiritually uplifted. They felt robbed. So famine chipped away at the church's reputation too. Inside monasteries, food rules got weird. The rule of St. Benedict set out fasting schedules. Meat was restricted. Meals were supposed to be simple. In famine years, this already austere diet became downright miserable. Bread crusts, watery beans, and whatever herbs they could scrape together. Monks probably told themselves it was a holy trial, but I suspect a few slipped into the cellar after dark for an extra bite. Silent orders must have had some very noisy stomachs in those years. Now, let's not forget bishops and abbots. These guys were not exactly humble hermits. A medieval abbot could live like a lord. Rich banquets, cellars of wine, imported spices. During famine, that lifestyle stood out even more. When peasants starved, bishops were still drinking claret. Chroniclers loved to point out the hypocrisy. It didn't look great when the shepherds of Christ had bigger feasts than their flocks. At the same time, famine was big business for the church. Charity, almsgiving, and masses for relief all ran through ecclesiastical hands. Monasteries gave bread, sometimes generously, sometimes grudgingly. Cathedrals organized processions with relics. Parish priests led prayers for rain. And yes, people paid for these services. Candles, donations, land grants. So, in a twisted way, famine filled church coffers, even while it emptied stomachs. There's also the small matter of plague. Famines and epidemics often went hand in hand, and monasteries with their communal living were perfect breeding grounds. Weak monks crowded in dormitories, sharing both prayers and germs. So famine didn't just reduce food, it thinned the choir stalls. Many monasteries lost half their brethren in famine years. The survivors wrote solemn chronicles about it, in between very hungry meals. Spiritual explanations filled the gap, of course. Famine was punishment for sin. Whose sin? That was always up for debate. Sometimes it was the peasants, too lazy or greedy. Sometimes the nobles, too violent or corrupt. Sometimes the clergy themselves, too indulgent. Everyone blamed everyone else. But strangely, the weather was rarely just blamed on the weather, because admitting that nature was in charge didn't fit medieval theology. Some monasteries innovated. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, abbeys in England experimented with growing alternative crops. More peas, beans, oats. Others bought imported grain from the Baltic, if they had the money. Monastic records show frantic purchases, pawning silver chalices to pay for carts of rye. So even holy houses felt the pinch. Prayers were nice, but cash still worked better. And then there's the moral panic side. Starving monks sometimes wrote about cannibalism rumors in villages. They described them with horror, while carefully not mentioning whether any desperate brothers tried similar things. We can assume most didn't. But famine blurred the lines of what was acceptable. Even the cloister walls couldn't entirely block the desperation outside. In art and sermons, famine became a metaphor. Empty tables symbolized sin. Withered fields symbolized faithlessness. Hungry bodies symbolized humility before God. Monks wrote about famine as both a disaster and a teaching tool, because if you're going to starve, you might as well make it a sermon point. So famine in monasteries was a mix. Yes, they were better supplied than peasants. They distributed some charity, but they also hoarded, demanded tithes, and kept their own bellies filled when possible. Some monks died alongside the poor. Others kept eating in candlelit halls while crowds starved at the gates. It all depended on the abbey, the abbot, and how long the famine dragged on. And when famine finally eased, monks recorded it in their annals. The famine ended this year, usually just one dry line. No big conclusion, no reflections. Just back to normal business, praying, farming, copying manuscripts, and occasionally sneaking a sip of wine. So famine touched the cloister too, though in quieter, more complicated ways. It showed both the best and the worst of the church. Charity mixed with greed, prayer mixed with practical farming, and hunger hummed even in the sacred silence. From here, let's drift outward again, because famine wasn't just about social class or religion. It also left deep cultural scars. People remembered, adapted, and invented strange traditions to cope. And those little survival strategies, some odd, some clever, some absurd, tell us even more about how medieval people lived with hunger. That's where we'll float next. We've drifted a long way tonight, through peasant huts and city riots, through noble banquets and monastic fasts. And if one thing is clear, it's that famine touched everyone, the poor most of all. But even kings and abbots weren't immune. Famine left scars that went far beyond empty stomachs. Villages abandoned, fields neglected, families broken. Even when harvests returned, the memories stayed sharp. Parents told their children stories about the hungry years. Cultural memory made famine a ghost that never fully left. Folklore absorbed it. Tales of witches stealing grain, stories of saints multiplying bread, legends of kings who saved their people, and others who let them starve. Songs and prayers carried the echoes of hunger long after the fields were green again. Even laws shifted. Some towns built permanent granaries, just in case. Some lords required their tenants to keep emergency stores, because everyone remembered how bad it felt when the cupboards were bare. And yet, despite all the suffering, people kept going. They found substitutes. They foraged weeds. They pawned their last belongings. They prayed, rioted, bargained, and survived. Human stubbornness in its simplest form. So, what did people really eat during medieval famines? The answer is almost anything. Grass, bark, acorns, cats, dogs, moss soup, famine bread, a grim buffet of desperation. But behind each odd recipe was the same simple drive: stay alive until the next harvest. And now, as we close the book on this long, strange journey through hunger, you can let your thoughts drift too. The famines are over. The peasants have gone to bed. The city riots have quieted. The monasteries are back to chanting psalms. And the nobles are once again feasting as they always did. So breathe out. Let your eyes grow heavy. And remember that even in history's hungriest moments, life somehow kept going. Good night and sleep well.